We are starting a new unit today, Unit 5. Our first lesson, Lesson 5.1, is fraction decomposition. You may have heard of the word decompose, which means to break down into maybe smaller pieces. Food, we have compost piles. Today, we're going to talk about breaking down fractions into smaller units or parts. You're going to need your whiteboard marker. You also will need Math Journal 2. You do not need Math Journal 1 anymore, so make sure you're in Math Journal number 2, which you received way back in September. On your whiteboard, though, let's do a quick warm-up. If we remember back to when we did a lot of work with fractions, we often found equivalent fractions. So here is an example. If I take 1/3 and I was asked to come up with an equivalent fraction, I could multiply the top number by 2 and the bottom number by 2 and get 2/6, which is equivalent or equal to 1/3. I could take that number times 3. If I multiply the numerator and the denominator by the same number, I would get 3/9, which is equivalent or equal to 1/3. I want you to find two equivalent fractions. Number 1, find two equivalent fractions for 2/5 and 2 for 4/7. You will need to pause your video at this time to come up with equivalent fractions. Now, you may not have the same equivalent fractions, but you should have used the same process. I'm going to multiply the top by 2 and the bottom by 2. So 4 and 5 times 2 is 10. 4/10 is equivalent to 2/5. Let's take that same 2/5 and multiply it by 4. 2 times 4 is 8, and 5 times 4 is 20. So 8/20 is equivalent or equal to 2/5. Moving on to 4/7. Maybe I want to multiply by 8. As long as I multiply the numerator and denominator by the same number, I will get an equivalent fraction. 4 times 8 is 32. 7 times 8 is 56. Maybe I want to multiply by 5. Multiply the top by 5 and the bottom by 5, the numerator and the denominator. 4 times 5 is 20. 7 times 5 is 35. So 20/35 is equivalent to 4/7. We are going to continue on our whiteboards. We're going to look at the fraction 5/8. We've spent quite a bit of time in the past talking about fractions, but today we're going to decompose or break down this fraction into its unit fractions, which are basically a fraction that has a numerator of 1, the top number. It represents the basic unit that can be added together to make other fractions. For example, if I look at 5/8, you can see that if I add up all of these pieces, it equals 5. If I were to break it down into unit fractions, I would take 1/8 plus 1/8 plus 1/8 plus 1/8 plus 1/8, which would get me back to 5/8. You can see the picture representation of that. Here we look at 1/6. If we take 1, 2, 3, 4 and add those together, 4/6 is represented by the blue shaded in fraction pieces. If we were to break that down into unit fractions, we're going to break it down into its smallest parts, where 1 is a numerator. This picture shows me 1/6 plus 1/6 plus 1/6 plus 1/6 gives me 4/6. So I decomposed the fraction or broke it down into its smallest parts. Sometimes we may just think of it as breaking it down into smaller parts, but maybe not all the way down to its unit fraction. In this case, we have 4/5. 1/5, 1/5, 1/5, and 1/5 added all together gives me 4/5. If I were to break it down into unit fractions, it would be 1/5 plus 1/5 plus 1/5 plus 1/5 equals 4/5. I can also decompose it a different way. I could break it into 2 unit fractions plus 2/5. And I still get 1, 2, 3, 4/5. So that's another way to decompose the fraction 4/5. If I look at 7/12, I can break that down into unit fractions by adding 1/12 plus 1/12 plus 1/12 plus 1/12 plus 1/12 plus 1/12 plus 1/12, which would give me 7/12. I also could decompose it a little bit differently. Maybe I want to take 3/12 added together with 4/12. Notice I'm just adding together my numerators. I'm still having a circle that's divided into 12 equal parts. 4 plus 3 is 7, and my denominator still stays 12. So those are 2 different ways to decompose 7/12. We're going to go ahead and move into journal number 2. Again, reminding you that we are no longer in that first journal. So we're going to go ahead and move into this journal. We're going to start on page 155. Page 155. At the top, it tells us our skill today is fraction decomposition. Number 1 says write an equation to show each fraction as the sum of unit fractions. When we see unit fractions, we know that the numerator has to be 1. Now in this case, all of our denominators will be 12s. So we're going to go ahead and add together unit fractions that will equal 5/12. So pick up your pencil and let's write. Here's 1 unit fraction. Remember, we're using 12s for this whole first problem. So 1/12 plus 1/12, writing with me, plus 1/12 plus 1/12 plus 1/12, together gives me a sum, and sum is what you do when you add 12s. Let's take number 2. For number 2, our denominator is going to be 100 throughout this problem. And in order for it to be a unit fraction, our numerator has to be 1. So to get 4/100ths, we have to add together 1/100th plus 1/100th plus 1/100th plus 1/100th gives me a sum of 4/100ths. Moving down on the page, I'll go to my next page, but we're still on page 155 in your journal. It says decompose 7/10 into a sum of fractions with the same denominator in 3 different ways. Record each decomposition with an equation and justify each one by shading in the parts of the circle. So it's asking me to write an equation and shade. They've done an example for you. They did not decompose it into unit fractions. Instead, they just decomposed it. So let's just do the same ways together for this journal page. How about if we take, remember, the denominator is the same, so everything will be tenths. Let's take 2/10. I'm going to go ahead and then shade in 2/10. I'm going to use different colors just so you can see the shading being a little bit different. Let's do that plus another 2/10. Remember, it has to equal 7 at the very end. Plus, let's do another 2/10. Let me do a different color, 2/10. 1/10 plus another 10. And so far we have 2, 4, 6. I need one more. One more 10th would give me 7/10. So let's go ahead and shade in another 10th. All together, let's go ahead and count. 1/10, 2/10, 3/10, 4/10, 5/10, 6/10, 7/10. Still equals 7/10. Moving down on your page 155, we're still making sure that each one of these equals 7/10 when we are done. Let's try 6/10. Let's shade in 6/10. 1/10, 2/10, 3/10, 4/10, 5/10, and 6/10. That means I need one more tenth to equal 7/10. So go ahead and shade in one more. Notice that the same amount is shaded each time of the circle. And one more way. Let's take 1/10. Go ahead and shade that in. Plus, let's do 4/10. 1/10, 2/10, 3/10, 4/10. Make sure you're doing this with me. So far I have 4 plus 1 is 5. Let's do 2 more. 5, 6, 7. Shade in 2 more tenths equals 7/10. Let me just count to make sure. 1/10, 2/10, 3/10, 4/10, 5/10, 6/10, 7/10. You are going to continue with your math lesson for today. Check Schoology to see what else you need to do.